I am with you always until the end of the world.
A couple of days ago, I was thinking about what kind of Easter message could I give? A message where I wouldn't have to shout at everybody, but instead give a peaceful message of hope. And I came across this simply beautiful chapter, which almost instantly became my favorite the moment I read it and understood it. And I'm going to share this chapter with you. It is John 21. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, that's John and James, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in a boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. This is the word of God. We love comeback stories. We love it when a boxer who's been knocked almost senseless in 7 rounds suddenly gets up in the 8th round and delivers a knockout punch. We love it when we see a tennis player 2 sets down and losing in the 3rd suddenly starts to make a fight back and takes the cup. We love it when we see an actor who's been at the top of his profession for years suddenly has a series of hits, but then comes back with a mega hit. We love stories like that. And I think the reason we like stories like this is because all of us sometimes reach a certain level on top, lose it, and then want to come back, want to make it where they were once upon a time. And of all the comeback stories that you will hear, there is possibly none better, none greater than this story that you just heard. What a comeback. Let me put this story in context for you. Jesus has died. He has risen from the dead. On the first day, the apostles are cowering in a room, scared of what is going to happen to them, and Jesus suddenly appears and he says to them, "Peace be with you." He talks to them for a little while, and then again he says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." A week later, he appears to them again. This time Thomas is with them. Thomas, who didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. Thomas, who told the other apostles, who had told them Jesus was alive, he says, "I will not believe till I put my fingers in his wounds." Jesus appears in front of Thomas and says, "Here I am. Put your fingers where you want to put them." Thomas did. And then he said to Thomas, "You have seen, that's why you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen, but still believe." And then Jesus appears for the third time in this story. It's a magnificent story that I'm telling you, you will love. Listen to it carefully. Peter and a few of his friends, the other apostles that Jesus had chosen, were sitting down, thinking about all the events that took place. The passion, the death, the resurrection, Jesus appearing to the people. But there was something in their hearts, something in their minds. There was a confusion that surrounded them. They were wondering what they were going to do with their lives. They were wondering what to do about this call that Jesus had given them. He said, "Come and I will make you fishers of men." But where was Jesus? He was coming and going, coming and going. He didn't really give them any sense of direction after he returned. They kept thinking about the various things that Jesus told them, and they were totally confused. Never before had they heard anybody preach like this. Give so that you might receive. He who wants to be first has to be last. Unless you die, you will not live. It was difficult for them to make sense of everything. You have to remember that these were simple men. And Peter finally decided he had it. He said, "This is all too complicated for me. This is all too much for me. I am going back to a life that I understand. I am returning to fishing. Are you coming with me?" And the other apostles, without batting an eyelid, because I'm sure that they too were equally confused, said, "We're coming with you." And instantly, each one of them who had followed Jesus for 3 years returned to their old life. The only thing is, there was a little problem. Jesus didn't want them to return to their old life. So what does he do? He stops the fish. He sends them somewhere else, with the result that these guys, expert fishermen, spent the entire night out there on the lake and didn't catch a single fish. Early morning comes. They return to the shore, frustrated, worried. What's going to happen now? Angry, confused. And suddenly they see a man standing on the shore. It's Jesus, but again, they don't recognize him. And I'm sure this confuses you as it confused me. How do they not recognize a man they've lived with for 3 years? And this is not the first time. Even before, when he came, they did not recognize him. And it made me wonder why. Until I realized the answer is so simple. Before he died, Jesus was locked in his human body. But after he rose from the dead, he didn't need to be locked in anybody. He could take any form that he wanted. And he did, and this is why the people around him didn't recognize the way he looked. So if Jesus comes to you today, there is a good chance that he will look nothing like what you have pictured him. So what might he look like? I remember in the early days I used to hear the voice of Jesus in my mind. I still hear him. But I miss seeing him. And one day I said to him, Jesus, I really would like to see you. Can I see you, please? And he said, yes, in time. The following week, I met a guy who was a very unpleasant guy. You know people like that. He started arguing with me about something that was totally stupid, and by the end of it, I really wanted to punch him on his nose. Anyway, I let him go. And then I heard Jesus whisper in my ear, Aneel, you wanted to see me, right? I was in that man. Now, what's the point of this story? Not that Jesus is an unpleasant guy who keeps arguing with you, but the fact that Jesus is in everybody around you. Somebody dropped a beautiful mail in my mailbox last week, and I usually just delete these forwards, but something made me read this mail, and I found it was a beautiful story. There was this lady who woke up one morning and went and checked her mailbox, and she found a letter in there. And she opened the letter, confused because there was no stamp, there was no postmark, nothing. She opened it and saw this message. I am in town and I would like to drop by to your house for lunch today. And it was signed Jesus. This woman was very excited, but she also was very disturbed because she was a very poor woman and didn't have anything to eat in the house and very little money to buy anything with. But she said, I'm having a guest like Jesus in my house. I need to get at least some bread and cheese so I can make him a sandwich. So she goes to the local supermarket, picks up some bread, picks up a sandwich, and is coming home. And as she comes home, she sees a couple huddled in one corner. They kind of crouch down and they're begging for food. And when they see this woman pass by, they ask her, please, can you give us something to eat? This woman looks at them and she has a good heart. But, she's having an important guest and she needs to be there for the guest. So she says, sorry, but I need this food for somebody else. And she continues to walk along the way. But she's not at peace. She turns back and sees the couple are again huddled and they're shivering. And she says, forget about the sandwich that I'm going to make for Jesus. I'm sure he'll understand. So she took the sandwich and gave it to this couple. And as she gave it to them, she noticed the woman was really shivering, shivering out of cold. She had a threadbare garment around her and her heart stirred again. So filled with compassion, she took off her own jacket and gave it to the woman. I said, I have a jacket, another jacket in my house. Let her use this. And she went home feeling a little sad that Jesus was going to come and he was going to be empty-handed. He was not going to have anything to eat, but still with a certain peace in her heart. And as she was about to enter the house, she saw the mailbox had another letter. And she was surprised because the postman usually came only once a day. So she goes and opens the letter, and it's another letter from Jesus. And he says, thank you for the beautiful lunch, and thank you for the coat. How do you recognize Jesus? Turn to your left, turn to your right. Do you see Jesus in that person? Well, you should. Yes. You should. Because Jesus is in all of us. Jesus is in that sister over there. Jesus is in that brother over there. And that sister. And that brother. And in me. And in me. You want to put your hands together? You're very quiet today. Anyway, let's get back to our story. It gets very interesting from here on. Peter sees this man standing on the shore, and he's very upset because he's not caught a fish all night. And this man asks a very stupid question. What is the question he asks? Have you caught any fish? And if you were a fisherman who spent the entire night fishing and not caught any fish, you're likely to be very upset, right? What would you do? Maybe you'd not say anything, but Peter at least had the decency to say no. And then the man says something very silly. He says, cast your net out to the right. Now come on. Think about it, all right? I'm an expert fisherman. I've been fishing all my life. I have just returned from the deep where the fish are. I'm a few meters from the sea, from the shore. What kind of fish can I expect to catch here in the shallows? What would you do? Because many times we also in positions like this. We think we know everything. We think we know so much. Somebody tells us to do something new. What do you know about it? I am the expert here. Someone speaks to you about the Bible. Hey, come on, I've done theology for 10 years. Who are you to tell me anything? Or I've studied for 14 years. What do you know about anything? We are like that. And I'm sure Peter felt that in his heart. Who are you, stranger, to tell me to drop my nets in the shallow water? But Peter is a different man. Peter has memories. And one of the memories that Peter has is of another incident that happened a little while ago. You'll find this story in Luke chapter 5. Jesus was one day preaching to the people by the lake Gennesaret. Finally, the people were too many, so he got into one of the boats that were there by the lake. And he started to preach to the people from the boats. After the people had gone, he told one of the fishermen, whose name was Peter, he said, let's go into the deep, we'll catch fish. Peter said the same words, we have been fishing all this while and have not caught anything. But he decided to obey. And he tossed his nets into the water. And the fish that he pulled out was so much the nets threatened to break. And maybe Peter just remembered this incident where somebody told him to throw his nets overboard. And he decided to obey. And good thing he did. Because this time when he pulled the nets up, there were 153 large fish in the nets. In our lives too, sometimes we think we have done everything we could. But there is that little voice in our heads that sometimes tells us, try to do something different. Try to do what I'm telling you to do. And whatever is hopeless in your lives, whatever you deem impossible in your lives, all the barrenness, all the emptiness will just go away if only you listen and do what I say. There are two qualifications for blessings in the Bible. They are faith and their obedience. And Jesus has spoken about faith numerous times. He has said, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, Matthew 17:20, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and the mountain will move. In Mark 9, a story that I've told you many times already, there is this father who has a son who is possessed, and he goes to Jesus one day and says, Master, if you can, please deliver my child. And Jesus says, if I can, anything is possible for him who believes. Faith is one of the requisites. And I'm telling you, every time we say a word of faith, God up there is telling his angels, go down and honor the words that he is saying. Which is why I tell you constantly, be positive in what you say. All the time what we do is say words of negativity. No, my life is useless. My life is meaningless. My marriage is in ruins. My health is bad. My child is disobedient. He's a drug addict and he's in bondage. All you're doing is affirming what the situation is. Instead, I've said this to you before too, and sometimes we need reminders. Start speaking words of life. Say, my relationship is improving. My health is getting better. God is restoring my finances. God is going to bless me with every single thing that I need in my life, and see what starts to happen. Faith is one of the requisites. But the second requisite is equally important, and that is obedience. Samuel speaks about how obedience is better than sacrifice. And I know we've just finished the period of Lent, and all of us in this room have possibly made some sacrifice or another. It might have been a small sacrifice like giving up chocolates. It might have been a bigger sacrifice like giving up meat. But I believe that many of us here made a sacrifice. To what point? To what purpose? What is more important is to obey God and obey the things that he asks us to do. And when we obey, there are blessings, there are plenty. In Exodus 19, he says, if you listen to my word and obey my covenant, I will make you a favored nation. A few chapters later in Exodus 23, he says, if you listen to what I say and do what I say, then I'm telling you, your enemies will become my enemies. Imagine a promise like this from God. He says he will continue to bless us if we're obedient. But then by the same token, if we're disobedient, then the blessing cease. And we see this happening right through history. Open the Bible, and right there in the Garden of Eden, you have Adam and Eve disobeying God. What happened? They lost paradise. Cain disobeyed God. He was thrown out of Eden and was forced to be a wanderer all his life. We look at other people. Moses, even great men like Moses. He was so blessed until one time God told him, speak to the rock. Some of you might not know this story, but there was a time when Israel wanted water. So God told Moses, strike the rock. He took a stick, he hit the rock, and water came out from it. A little while later, the people were thirsty again. And God said to Moses, this time he didn't say, strike the rock. This time he said, speak to the rock. Moses remembers something. He said, the last time I struck the rock, water came out. I don't need to speak to it. I will strike it. He disobeyed God, and because of that, he was not allowed to enter the promised land. Imagine that. We find another great story in Lot's wife. Lot and wife lived in a town called Sodom that was so wicked. God said he was going to destroy that city. But because Lot was an honorable man, because he was a righteous man in God's eyes, God said, you can take your wife and your family and leave. But when you leave, do not look back. Lot's wife turned and looked back. And what happened to her? She turned into a pillar of salt. In our lives too, now I'm not saying if you're disobedient to God once or twice, you're going to turn into pillars of salt. But I am saying, and listen to this carefully, if you persist in being disobedient to God, you will lose his favor. But if, on the other hand, you're obedient to his word and you have faith that God will honor his promises, there is nothing that he will not do for you in your life. Now, back to the story. You see how wonderfully the story is linked to other places in the Bible. Now, they pick up their nets with 153 fish on them, and something clicks in a few heads there. They remember this had happened before, and they remember who had made it happen before. Jesus. It is the Lord, John said. And Peter says, yes, of course it is. And what does he do? Start rowing. He can't wait. He puts on his clothes, jumps into the water, and swims towards Jesus. Where have we heard a story like this before? Yes. Matthew 14. One day Peter and the apostles were in the middle of the lake, and they see Jesus coming towards them. They first think it is a ghost until Jesus says, hey guys, cool it, it's only me. And then Peter does something. What does he do? He says, I want to come to you. What is it in Peter's heart that makes him want to do things like these? It is the tremendous love that he has for his Lord. And whenever he sees Jesus, he just wants to be with him. Now, Peter is just like any of us. I mean, he's as typical as we are. He had a temper, he was obstinate, he was stubborn, he had just about every character flaw that you can imagine. He had this habit of speaking faster than his brain could think. But he had one thing going for him, and that was a tremendous love for Jesus. And back there when Jesus was coming on the water, he says, Jesus, I want to come to you. And Jesus said, come. And he jumped out of the boat and began to walk on the water. And here again, the moment he knows it is Jesus, he can't wait to be with his Lord. And he jumps out of the boat. And yes, he's in shallow water, but it could be deep in certain pockets. He doesn't care. He just wants to be with Jesus as fast as he can possibly be. And then he goes to the shore, and he finds that Jesus is already got a barbecue going. I mean, there's bread on it, there's fish on it. Where did it come from? Where did it come from? Nobody knows. But in the Old Testament, you will find another story of a similar miracle. Elijah was one day very disappointed with the world. You know, he was very angry and he was very afraid, like many of us are. And he went into the desert and he said, I'm ready to die. I'm sick of this world. I don't want to have anything more to do with it. And suddenly an angel tapped him and said, yo, stop feeling so sorry for yourself. Eat some food, you'll feel better. And he turns around and he sees on a coal pit, there is some food being cooked there. Jesus has some food cooking here too. Ready for Peter, ready for us. I know that you're depressed in this room. I know that many of you are miserable. I know that for many of us, our lives are going nowhere. Jesus has food waiting. But even as he says, breakfast is served, there is food over there for every one of them. He says, give me some of your fish. Jesus needs us to work together with him to fulfill his plans here on earth. Do you remember the time on the mountainside? He had finished preaching to the people. And then the apostles went to him and said, it is getting late. We need to send these people away. They need to eat. And Jesus said, we will feed them. What did Jesus do? He could have easily reached into the heavens and got some food for these people. But instead, what does he do? He finds a little boy who has just a few loaves of bread and a few fish. And he takes what that little boy had to offer and he multiplied it. And everybody over there ate. What does this tell you? That each and every one of you might not have much. Okay, you might not have much. But in the hands of a living God, even the little you have can reach out to a lot of people. Even the little that you give can be multiplied and turned into something tremendous. This is what he wanted Peter also over there to understand. And now scripture says all these guys were sitting there by Jesus. They didn't have the courage to ask him who he was, because in their hearts they knew that this was the Lord. In your hearts, you know. In your hearts, you know every single time that you come to this place, and every single time that you hear me calling you, that it is really God who calls you. You know in your heart. You might not recognize me as being from God, but you do recognize the words as coming from him. You are here and you're feasting of the word, just as the apostles feasted with the bread and the fish. And then Jesus turns to Peter. I just love this part. I just love this part so much it makes me almost want to weep, because it is a story of restoration. It is a story of the greatest comeback the world has ever seen. He turns to Peter and says, Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I do. And he says, feed my lambs. And then he asks Peter again, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, I do. And he says, look after my sheep. And then once again he turns to Peter and says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter now is a little upset. He's a little upset because he says, why is my Lord questioning me like this? Of course I love you, Lord. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. Why does Jesus ask Peter 3 times, do you love me? Because he denied Jesus 3 times. I'm going to take you back to that story. Even though I know I've told you this story before, there are connections here that have to be made. Jesus has just celebrated the Last Supper. You got to be in this picture, all right? Jesus has just celebrated the Last Supper. He's broken bread and given wine to the apostles and told them that this is his body and this is his blood. And then he turns to Peter and he says to Peter something very strange. He says, Peter, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith will not fail. And after you have turned back, you will strengthen your brothers. Jesus knows that Peter is going to betray him. But he does not pray that Peter will be strong. He does not pray that Peter will not let him down. He does not pray that Peter will be filled with courage and strength. He prays a very strange prayer. He says, Peter, I pray that your faith may not fail. And then he continues that prayer. When you have returned, when you have converted, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And then, as we all know, Peter said, no way am I going to do that. I'm going to follow you to jail. I'm going to follow you to death. Jesus says, you don't know what you're saying, tough guy. Before the cock crows, you're going to betray me thrice. And that is exactly what happened. And one of the reasons Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me, is because Jesus wants to remind Peter of the times that he denied him. And the 3 times that Jesus says to him, feed my sheep, take care of my lambs, feed my lambs, he's saying, now your faith has come back. Look after my sheep. Strengthen them, make them strong, make them courageous. Teach them of the one thing that I want everybody in this world to know, is that I love them and that I am a God of second chances. We all need second chances in our lives. Each and every one of us sitting here needs second chances in our lives. I was in Chennai last week, and I met an old friend of mine. She's very close to me and my wife. And she's one of the people who really prayed hard for me at the time just before I converted. I'm not going to tell you who she is, but hopefully one day soon she will testify. Very soon after I returned to God, though, she went away from God. Life got in the way of things. And she returned to her old life just as Peter returned to his old life. She came for my retreat in Chennai. And by the end of the 3rd day, God had done something in her heart that changed her completely. And overnight, she stopped doing every single thing that she was doing wrong and was back on the path to God. And I believe, and you will see this for a fact very soon, I believe not long in the future she will stand again in front of people proclaiming his word and singing music to him just as she used to do in the past, even greater than ever before, I believe. But each and every one of us here has a story like hers. Each and every single person sitting over here has reached some point in their lives and have kind of gone down. It happens to all of us. It happens even to me. I remember the times when I just came to Christ. Man, I used to spend hours and hours on my knees just praying and glorifying him. And this is also something that this sister of mine reminded me. And she said, I remember when you came to God, you were like a little child. You just spent hours praying. And just that memory made me come back and get to my knees again, just like I used to in the old days. And the experience was so beautiful. We all need second chances. Now, God is giving us second chances. Each and every one of us. It doesn't matter if you fail. It doesn't matter if you're caught in a rut. Peter was caught in a rut. His life was going nowhere. He was confused about a lot of things. He didn't know what to do. He was totally stuck. Until Jesus says, there's another thing you can do to get out of that rut. Peter did what Jesus asked him to do. I want you here in this room to do what Jesus is asking you to do too. Get out of the rut that you're in. Have faith in him and his abilities to change everything in your life and be obedient to him and listen to the things and do what he asks you to do. And to everyone who is here on the shore now, every one of you who's sitting here sharing of this little meal that I've prepared for you tonight, to every one of you, Jesus is asking, do you love me? He has asked it of everyone since the beginning of time. He asked Eve, do you love me enough to believe that my asking you not to eat of this fruit is for your protection. Do you love me? He asked Adam, do you love me more than your wife? Do you love me more to do the things that will please me rather than please her? He asked it of Cain, do you love me enough to do things, make me offerings that are pleasing to me? He asked Abraham, do you love me enough to leave your household and all your possessions and come to me to a distant land? Do you love me enough to sacrifice your son? He asked Job, do you love me? Even though every single thing that you have in your life might be taken away from you, do you love me? He's asking you that here tonight. Do you love me? Do you love me to turn the other cheek when somebody hits you? Do you love me enough to forgive those who have caused you pain, those who have hurt you? Do you love me enough to put everyone else in your life before you, above you? Do you love me enough to die to your passions, to die to your greed, to die to your lust? Do you love me? We all are ready to say we love God. Each and every one of us here, I'll be very surprised if anyone in this room says, I don't. But love that is only words and does not correspond with actions is no love at all. If I tell my wife I love her, and then I'm having affairs all the time, I don't love her, no matter how many times I might tell her that. We have to love God. And love translates into actions. And if you don't have the actions, there is something wrong with the love. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. They're hungry. They're thirsty. They're dying out there in the world, and nobody cares for them. Feed them. Do you love me? Look after my lambs. Look after your children. Look after your brothers and your sisters. Look after your parents. Look after the people around you who might need your help. Do you love me? He's asking you that here. Each and every one of you.